So let us start today's daf. I assume he's up to the two dots, right? At the bottom of Yud Zayin Amabet. 15 lines, he said. I'm assuming that's 15 lines. So we're right at the end of the first parak. Some might have finished the first parak, but for those who didn't,
What page?
Today is Yud Chet in Sanhedrin, and we are going to start from Yud Zayin Amabet at the two dots near the bottom. So
Wonderful.
The last discussion in our Mishnah, which started the parak, the Masechta, 2.5 weeks ago, was how many people do you have to have in a city in order to justify having a court? So I said, Kami Yehe Be'ir, and you could have a Sanhedrin, a court of 23. We said it has to have at least 120 people. So says the Gemara, let's read that inside. Kami Yehe Be'ir v'Yehe Ruya Sanhedrin, Me'av Esrim. Says the Gemara, Me'av Esrim Ma'av V'Datai. Where'd you get 120 from? Like, what's that number? It seems like a pretty random number. Says the Gemara, well, it turns out you need 23 judges, right? Now, it's not 100% clear. I'm not going to eat that. It's not 100% clear why they have to live in the city, right? Because in theory, you could have judges who come from elsewhere. But we're assuming, which is an interesting thing, right, that the judges are local. And so you have to have at least 23, and 120 here means like, 600,000 Yotzei Mitzrayim. It means families or units, right? So 120 have to have at least 23 judges, because that's the size of the court. Asrim Shlosha Keneged Sanhedrin Kitana. V'shalosh shurot shel asrim v'shlosha, as we've already discussed, you have to have 3 rows. We're going to have more discussion about this, but you're going to have 3 rows of apprentices, basically, who are there both to listen and to fill in if someone gets sick, or to add to the case sometimes, but mainly
they're alternates, right?
It's interesting. They're sort of alternates, but they're not exactly alternates. We're going to get into alternates in a second. They're more students, and their real goal is to educate. But remember, we talked about how sometimes they can have a comment, and if they say something good, we'll bring them up from the minor leagues, kind of. So, but they're mainly there to learn and to provide feedback. So you need to have 3 rows of 23, and that's altogether 4 times 23 is Harei Tishim V'Shtayim. So the Tishim V'Tarti, 92 for those taking the SAT. And so you have 92 people at least in your city who are all judges or student judges. But then you need to always have, in order to have a city, you have to have a Asara Batlanim Shel Beit HaKnesset. Or you have to, every city, we learned about this in Megillah, has to have 10 Batlanim, which means 10 people who are not working, or not doing nothing, because you need to be able to provide in a city for functions. So they need to be the ones who go to Shachrit, who are there for burials, for, anything you need a minion for. You need to have 10 people who can reliably, who aren't going to be out in the field or at work, and you can count on them. So you need to have 10 more people. Harei may have a trait, it's 102. And then you have to think about all the people who work in the court. Shnei Sofrim, you need to have 2 scribes, because one, won't get it all. Vishnei Chazanim, you have to have 2 Chazanim. Now, Rashi explains that Chazan is not a singer, as we have, but these are Shamashim. These are people who basically, they're in charge of keeping things on track. They submit the summonses, they hit people, they're
court officers.
Court officers,
Clerks.
thank you.
Clerks.
Okay. Vishnei Balei Dinim. Now, of course, there's no point in having a court if you don't have people to come to court. So you have to have at least 2 people sitting in the town who might disagree with each other or kill each other, so that they have to come to court. Okay, well, one can kill the other.
And they can't be part of the 10.
Right. I guess you have to assume that even you'd have, because your town would fall apart, right? If you didn't have an extra 10. Anyways, Shnei Edim. Now, of course, you can't go to court unless people saw it. So you have to have at least 2 uninvolved people who are not judges and are not the ones being killed or killing, and are the Edim, right? And of course, you can't have Edim unless they're concerned that if they give false testimony, someone's going to say you weren't there. So you need to have 2 potential Zomimim, right? Zomimim. Those are people who could say, wait a second, how can you and Reuven Shimon say you saw Levi kills Yehuda? You were with us in the pub on that day. And of course, Zomimim also have to be worried. So you have to have Shnei Zomimei Zomimim. 2 people can say, you couldn't have seen them not being there because you were somewhere else. So, Harei Mei of our Beisar. So we need 114 people for the major parts of the case. Now, it turns out that you need some more people. Vitanya, because we have another Braita which says, we are now 8 lines from the bottom of Yud Zayin Amabet. Kol ir she'im ba asara dvarim halalu ein tamidei chachamim rashai l'dor b'tocho. Any city that doesn't have the following 10 features is not a good place for scholars to live. Meaning, it's not like you can't live there, but it's ill-advised, right? You have to have 10 things in your city in order for it to be a well-functioning, properly secure city. What are those 10 things? First is a Beit Din. Well, you need to have a court that's makin v'onchin that can punish and take things into their own hands. Otherwise, it's anarchy, right? So, and you need a kupa shel tzedakah, and you need a charity system, right? If you don't have social services, it's not point no city. Now, in order to have social services, you have to do two parts, as everyone knows, especially the social workers. You have to have intake of resources, and you have to give out resources. So in order to have a proper kupa shel tzedakah, you have to have two people taking in the money, because you don't trust one, and three people giving it out. So nigbeit b'shnayim, you collect with two, umitchaleket b'shlosha. So most Rashi, well, one explanation Rashi is that these are 5 more people you need for your city. So the courts you don't need. We already counted the courts, right? But you need 5 more people to be the social services, okay? Collecting money and giving it out. And then in addition, what you need is a Beit HaKnesset, which is not a person, right? It's a building. And you need a Beit HaMerchatz, you definitely need a bathhouse. And a Beit HaKiseh, you need a bathroom, right? And now you need more people. You need a rofei. Sounds a lot like a doctor, but Rashi says it's not. Rashi says it's a mohel. It's someone to circumcise, which might be a lot like a doctor. And an uman is a bloodletter, or what we call a barber, right? The lavlar, and the lavlar is a scribe. And you need a malame tinokot, and you need someone who can teach kids school, right? So Rashi understands that that's all one person can do all that, right? Meaning we're up to 119, and you can get one person who can be the scribe and the slaughterer and the teacher and the mohel and the bloodletter. So very, very multitasking. Others count.
Four of them have to do with blood.
Okay, others, and one teaches kids. Anyways, others look at it differently, but anyways, that's how you get to 120. Mishum Rabbi Akiva Omer says Rabbi Akiva, you're missing one essential thing in your town. What are you missing? Af mine pira. You got to have a fruit store, right? Because fruit is necessary for, you got to have your vitamin C and your other things. So you've got to also have that. So that would probably require another person, or maybe that person would run the school also. Anyway, so
vitamin A for his eyes.
I'm sorry, vitamin A is for the eyes. Okay, that's true. That is mi'urin carrots, right? As they say. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, we said in our Mishnah you had to have 160 some number, 170 something, 100 and whatever he said. When you find the Mishnah. Sorry, I don't want to make it up. Rabbi Nechemia said in the Mishnah that you have to have
230.
Thank you. 230 is what he said, because you have to add 10 times 23. Sarei asarot, right? The people in charge of the 23 are each in charge of 10. So you have to be in charge of 10 people. You're the 10th, not 10 separate people. 10 people plus you. Tanya Rebbe Omer, Rebbe said, you don't need 230. You need 277. You need 277. And this is what Miriam said before, because you need alternates. And remember, the way the court worked is you started with 23. 23 was a good number because there's always an odd number. But let's say a person said, I don't know what to do. A person can always say, one of the judges or 5 of the judges can say, we just can't figure it out. So then they get dropped, and then you have to add people. And you always add up till 70 people, right? So, I mean, 2 at a time, up to 70. So therefore, you need to have those up potentially 47 alternates. So 230 plus 47. So that's 277. And it says, but there's a bright about Tanya, the top line of Yud Chet Amud Aleph, Rabbi Omer 278, you need 278. And of course, Lokasha, that depends on whether you need to have 70 in a court or 71, right? Lokasha, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbanan. Tanur Rabbanan says the Braita, V'samta is the pasuk of Yitro telling Hashem telling Moshe what to do when Yitro commanded it or advised it. V'samta aleim sarei alafim. You should have people in charge of thousands. Sarei meot, sarei chamishim, sarei asot, sarei alafim. Let's do a little math exercise here, right? There were 600,000 people. So therefore, how many people are there if each one's in charge of 1,000? There's 600. Meot, sarei meot. There's 600 in charge of 1,000. Sheishet alafim, who are sarei chamishim. Sorry, I'm backwards. I read it wrong. The sarei alafim are sheish meot. The ones in charge of 1,000 are 600. That's 600,000. The sarei meot are sheishet alafim, or 6,000. The sarei chamishim is double that. Shnei masrei alaf, right? Sarei asarot, those in charge of 10, are 60,000, right? So a lot of jobs in the town. Shishet ribo, 6 times 10,000. Nimtzu, it turns out that Dainei Yisrael, that the number of judges were Shiva ribo which is 70,000, Shmonat Alafim Shesh Meot, so 78,600 judges. So a lot of people worked for the government in the midbar, in the desert.
There were a lot of people.
Well, anyways, I'm not sure they're all paid, but they all worked. Hadron Allah Dinei Mamonot. Continues the second parak of Masechet Sanhedrin at the Mishnah, Kohen Gadol. Now we're going to see some special categories here. And we're obviously going to start with the Kohen Gadol. We're going to get into the kings in a second. But a Kohen Gadol is a regular member of the, I don't know what the word is in English, the jurisprudence, we're going to say. He is Dan Vidanin. He can bring people to court and he can be the subject, the plaintiff or the opposite of plaintiff? The defendant, right? So he can either go to court and say that, so-and-so took money from me, or so-and-so wrecked my car or killed my son or whatever. And he can or killed me, I guess, or he can be the defendant, right? Where someone claims that he owes money. He can be a witness, or he can be witnessed about. I mean, you can take witness testimony about him. He can do chalitza. Now you ask why we're bringing this. It's going to be very important. But a Kohen Gadol can do chalitza, and you could do chalitza to his wife. Now, meaning if he has a brother who dies and the brother's wife is there, he can do chalitza to that widow to free her. Umiyabmin et ishto, and you could do yibam to his wife, but he cannot do yibam to his brother's wife. Avahu eno miyabim, he cannot do yibam if his brother dies childless. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to do yibam. He could do chalitza, but not yibam. And the reason he can't do yibam is if neshu asur be'almana, right? Because a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. Now, of course, you guys all remember from Masechet Yevamot that this does not make any sense, because the asay of yibum should be docha, the lot asay of not marrying an almana. So the Gemara is going to discuss that tomorrow. But that is what the Mishnah says. You can't. Now, mate lo mate. Let's say a Kohen Gadol has a relative who dies, right? One of his close relatives, his parents, children, spouse, siblings. Eno yotzei achar hamita. He shouldn't follow the coffin. It's not really a coffin, right? The bed that they carry the body out of the town, basically, to bury it. He shouldn't follow directly. Rashi says because we're worried that he's going to touch the coffin. He's going to be so overcome with emotion and reach out and touch it, and he's not allowed to become tamei. So he can follow at a distance. What's that mean? That if they would walk from a courtyard to courtyard, he can't be in the same courtyard as them. So if they walk out of the courtyard, he then comes into the courtyard. If they walk into the next one, he goes outside. So Elahein nichnasim, they go in, meaning go into the courtyard. V'hu nigla, and he's covered. Hein niglin, v'hu nichsa, v'yotzei imahem ad petach shar ha'ir. And he can walk out behind them at a distance up till the gates of the city, but you can't leave the city, assuming it's Yerushalayim, right? Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't agree with that at all. He can't walk behind the thing at all, even a little bit, even at a distance. Eno yotzei min hamikdash. He can't even leave the Beit HaMikdash. Mishum shenemar, because the Torah seems to say, umin hamikdash lo yitzei. Right, so we're going to see in tomorrow, I think, also where in the world Rabbi Meir gets his opinion. But the Gemara, the pasuk implies that Kohen Gadol, remember when the pasuk talks about becoming tamei, cannot become tamei, unlike a Kohen Hedyot who can. And umin hamikdash lo yitzei, which says Rabbi Yehuda means don't leave home or don't leave the Beit HaMikdash. So we'll discuss that tomorrow.
But that makes sense, because didn't we say that back then most places had tum'ah anyway?
I mean, there's tumat mate, right? There's different levels of tuma. So I think when we're very worried, you're talking about like the paraduma with the little kids.
Yeah.
That I think that's other levels of tuma, like tumat veset, tumat avanida, or zav, but not necessarily tumat mate. They were very fastidious about it. So in theory, the Kohen Gadol can walk the streets. It's not like you can't go anywhere, but he can't walk the street behind a coffin of a relative. James, all you were going to ask? Sorry. Nope.
Why he can't leave the city, but maybe that was answered by Miriam just now.
Oh, no. So it's a good question. I think it's more that he can't, we'll see tomorrow actually, more about why Rabbi Meir holds what he does. But again, the whole point here is we don't want the Kohen Gadol to become tamei. Now, when the Kohen Gadol is minachem other people, so unlike the way we do it today, where if people have been at cemeteries, we usually do this in the cemetery, but you can do it outside, where the people form like a row, a shura, and the grieving person walks through them, and you say Makom Menachem, or you say whatever you say in the cemetery. It seems like they used to do, and we'll discuss this tomorrow also, I think, in the next day. They used to do it the other way, where the mourner would stand and the people would walk by the mourner and say words of comfort as they walked by. So if the Kohen Gadol is walking by the mourner, then says the Mishnah, Kishu menachem achirim, when he comforts others, then derech kol ha'am ovrim b'zeh chazeh. Usually the way he did is that all the people would walk in a line, one after the other. V'hamimuneh, now we'll see the mimuneh was like the Sgan Kohen Gadol, the vice president or vice Kohen Gadol, would be mimatzo beino levein ha'am. He would separate between him and the people, meaning. Now, Rashi explains that it doesn't mean between the people and the Kohen Gadol, that you would have the mourner in a fixed place. The people would be walking by. The Kohen Gadol would basically walk down the middle. His skan would be on his right, and all of the regular people would be on his left. So he would be centered, basically, by his skan. Okay? When he receives comfort from others, right? So whether he's in the cemetery, he doesn't go to the cemetery, but whether he's in the city or he's in his home, in the Beit HaMikdash, let's say, he stands there and people come to give him comfort. The people would say to him, Anu kaparatcha, we are a kapara for you, meaning we accept any punishment you would have, we take it on ourselves. And he would say to them, Titbarchu min hashamayim, you should be blessed by heaven. Now, when they would give him the Sudat Havra'ah, which remembers that first meal that after the burial, that's a very important mitzvah. Usually you sit on the floor to do that, but a Kohen Gadol, it's not kavod for that. So they'd actually do it the opposite. Kol ha'am misubin al haaretz, the people would sit on the floor. V'hu meisiv al safsal, he would sit on the stool because of kavod of the Kohen Gadol. These are all halachot of the Kohen Gadol. Now, in contrast, continues the Mishnah, the Melech. What about the king? The Melech, on the other hand, and we'll see why in the Gemara, lo dan v'lo danaynato. He is not part of din. You can't bring the king to court, and he can't bring other people to court. And we'll see in the Gemara, it's not really true about everyone. It's true only about Machne Yisrael because they were worried about whatever. We'll talk about politics tomorrow. We'll get to politics. So says the Mishnah, lo dan v'lo daninoto, lo me'id v'lo me'idinoto. He can't be a witness, and you can't be testify about him. And we'll see, of course, right? If you're not part of the jurisprudence system, you can't be part of it in part. Now, he doesn't do chalitza, and you don't do chalitza to his wife or his widow because it's considered to be not respectful to the king to be part of that ceremony with chalitza. And and you don't do yibum. He can't do yibum because he can't. It's below the respect, let's say, of the king to marry someone else's wife, or even his brother, and you don't do yibum to his wife. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. That means you can't force him to do it. But in Ratzah lachlotz oli abim zachor latov, if he wants to do it to help his brother's widow, he's allowed to do it. So it's not against the rules, but you can't require him to do it.
So what happens to his widow or his brother's widow? She's aguna?
An aguna for life, right? So that's one of the. According to this Gemara, we'll discuss a little bit more. But yes, that's potentially the situation, and that should give anyone pause before they marry a king. Amrulo, they said to him, Ein shomin lo, no, you don't listen to him. And says the Mishnah further, forget about his brother, Ein nosin almanato. No one can marry the widow of a king, meaning when a king dies, his wife or wives, as most kings in those days had it, would become widows. And no one's allowed to marry those queens because it's below the covet of the dead king for someone else to marry her. And she's an aguna for life. And Yehuda says, well, actually, another king can marry them. No, say hamelech hamenato shel melech. The next king, assuming it's not the king's son, I guess, can marry that widow. Shkematzina b'David, because in fact you find by David shenasa hamenato shel Shaul that he married. We don't actually know who this is, but he married one of the widows of Shaul. Shenemar, because the pasuk says that nelachat beit adonecha. I will give you the house, meaning the possessions of my master, of Shaul, and his wives. So David married widows of Shaul, or one at least, and therefore a king's allowed to do that.
Okay. Would it be able to be his brother not using yibum?
It would not be able to his brother not using. You're not allowed to marry. So you mean the prohibition of Eshet Achich is in standing. So no, he could not. And he couldn't marry if it was a son, he can't marry his mother or his father's wife, right? Which is also a prohibition, even if it's not his mother. right?
Mhm, mhm.
Continues the Gemara, says the Gemara, second to last narrow line. Kohen Gadol dan. The mission is Kohen Gadol can be part of a court case. Pshita, why not? Right? Says the Gemara, you're right. But danina tot strichale. Well, the chiddush is that we could don him. You might have thought, oh, he's so great, he's a Kohen Gadol, and we don't want to bring him to court because he crashed someone's car. He gets diplomatic immunity, right? The chiddush is that's not the case. Says the Gemara, well, that's also pshita because he lo dainina lay. If you don't let him be judged, then he can't judge somebody else. I mean, he can't hold against someone else because you have to have both ways, right? Ihu heicha dayan. The pasuk says, and we darshan this many times, hit kosheshu v'koshu, which we darshan. Rish Lakish says, kishot atzmecha v'achar kishot achirim. Tie yourself up, meaning hold yourself responsible, and then hold other people responsible. Meaning, if the rules don't apply to you, you can't hold them against somebody else. Ella says, "You're right. I need to buy the mitni melech lodam lodanin oto because we want to tell you about a king that he is not part of the judge of the court system. We wanted to contrast that to Kohen Gadol, who is Tana Nami Kohen Gadol dan v'danin. That's one explanation. And the other explanation is that there is one judgment that we might make of Kohen Gadol, which we would have doubt about. And that is a specific case about a Kohen Gadol who kills someone b'shogeg. Right? If you recall, and we're going to have a Masechet Makot coming up next, the important halacha that if a person kills someone else b'mezid, they get killed, right? If you kill someone else by mistake, you have the axe in the forest and it flies off your handle, your hatchet, and someone dies, then we learn that, the Torah says you go to galut, right? You go to exile. And you stay in exile until
The Kohen Gadol dies.
the Kohen Gadol dies. So exile is meant to be temporary. Now, of course, you may not outlive the Kohen Gadol. So some people, it's forever, but it's not a permanent punishment. It's a temporary punishment with an arbitrary end, essentially, right? But if you're the Kohen Gadol and you go to exile, then it's a life sentence because either. Once the Kohen Gadol dies, you also are dead, right? So therefore, maybe the rule of Galut does not apply to a Kohen Gadol who kills someone by mistake because there can't be an end to it. So the Mishnah is coming to tell you that, in fact, you do have a rule for the Kohen Gadol.
It also doesn't make logistics sense. How is he going to serve in the temple?
I think that it would be very challenging, but he still is the Kohen Gadol.
Doesn't lose his status?
I'm sorry?
He doesn't lose his status?
You don't lose your status just for accidentally killing somebody. They'd have to have a skan who fills in, who also, it's Meshuach Sha'avar. We have all these temporary positions, but you don't get. I don't think there's any category. I mean, I guess I'm not sure, but there's no impeachment of the Kohen Gadol. So I can't say for sure if you don't do anything. But anyways, this is killing someone with shogeg. I mean, it wasn't necessarily so bad. It's just a technical problem.
Oh my God.
Says it's Kamashwan Kidatanya, like the following bright, the 5 lines from the bottom. Kohen Gadol Shaharaga Tenefesh B'Mezid. Kohen Gadol kills someone on purpose, Nerag. He gets killed, again, assuming you have witnesses and all that. B'Shogeg, but if he does it by mistake, Goleh. He goes to Galut, and he can be, it's not clear what these words mean, we'll see in a second. Over al-aseh v'alo-taseh. He's over, it's not clear if it means he can be, he should be, he is over in a mitzvah taseh and a mitzvah lo taseh. Now says it continues the Braita, he's like a regular guy for all these legal consequences. Says the Gemara, well, in a second. B'mezid neharak. What do you mean? B'mezid he gets killed. Pshita, of course he gets killed. Says the Gemara, you're right. It is obvious. But the chiddush is b'shogeg, goleh, it's strichale. The chiddush is that we send him to galut if he does it b'shogeg. Because says the Gemara, hanami pshita. Why isn't that also obvious? It's strich. In fact, we need to teach you that. I would have thought, because it says in the pasuk, the Yashav ba ad mota kohen gadol, that the guy goes to the person, the killer, the mistaken killer, goes to Galut and sits there until the Kohen Gadol dies. You would have thought, Ema, well, that means it's supposed to be a temporary punishment. And called itle takanta b'chazara, anyone who can have a takana with going back home if the Kohen Gadol dies, legally he goes to Galut. But the letbe takanta, if you have no way out, so it's going to be a life sentence, maybe chazara, legally. It's not, as the Mishnah very much reminds us, we'll get to this Mishnah in Masechet Makot, on the top of Daf Yud Chet Amud Bet. Ahorei Kohen Gadol, if a person kills the Kohen Gadol, so then you have a problem also, because Tosa says, assuming they didn't appoint a new one yet, right? If you kill the Kohen Gadol by mistake, and you run away to Galut, when are you going to ever get out? When the Kohen Gadol dies, but there is no Kohen Gadol to die, so you're going to be there forever. Oh, Kohen Gadol Shaharag, or in our case, the Kohen Gadol killed someone else by mistake. So he's the Kohen Gadol goes to Galut, but he'll never get out. Et nefesh, ein yotze misham lo'olam. Those people never leave. So Ema, you would have thought low legally that you don't then go to Galut because it's not supposed to be a lifelong punishment. Kamash Milan says, well, maybe in fact that's true. Ema Chinami. Amakra, the pasuk says, Lanus Shama, you run there, Kol Rotseya, all murderers. Afilu Kohen Gadol b'mashma, that everyone, even these unusual cases of a person who kills a Kohen Gadol or a Kohen Gadol who kills somebody else.
What if it takes 3 days for the Kohen Gadol to die?
Then what? You mean, and they appoint a new one?
No, then you're there for 2 days.
Oh, well, you don't have to be there until he's dead. I mean, you're not Chayav Mita until he's dead, right?
Catch 22. Yes.
Okay, says the Gemara, 2 dots. Over al seva lo taseh. The Kohen Gadol can be over naseh lo taseh. What the heck does that mean? Lo sagdi lo avar. You mean he can't avoid that? What are you talking about? Remember, this is what we mean. We mean im avar al save lo taseh lo kenyo the chol davar. If he goes against an aseh or lo taseh, he doesn't take the lulav on Sukkot, or he doesn't, or he I don't know, eats basar b'chalav, which is a lo taseh, then he is like every other person. He gets makot, or he gets whatever punishment we would give. Says Mar Pshita, that seems pretty obvious also. Says Mar, well, it is obvious, but we would have thought, I would have thought, it's not, as we had in our Mishnah in the beginning of Perek Aleph, Ein danin lo et shevet lo et navi sheker. You don't judge a navi or shevet, velo et kohen gadol, or a kohen gadol, el al pi beitin shel shivim ve'echad. That you only judge a kohen gadol with 71. Now, we learned earlier that that's referring to a capital case. Let's say kohen gadol kills somebody. But you might have thought that that's true about everything. Right? You might have thought that's true even if he eats basar b'chalav, that you can't give him makot with 3, you have to get 71. With that, which means davarav shel gadol. Davar hagadol, which literally means a big matter, but we darshan to mean a matter of a big person, right? A davar shel gadol. So Ema, you would have thought maybe everything, kol davarav shel gadol. Even a kohen gadol who does something very minor, not minor, but a lo taseh or even an aseh, that you would have to bring it to court to judge it, to the court of 71. Kamash malan, that you only that only capital things, not things like makot or smaller things. How do you know? Emachinami says because it says michtiv davrei gadol. It doesn't say the things of the great person. It says ha davar ha gadol ktiv. It has to be an important thing of an important person. Davar gadol mamash. So it has to be an important matter, meaning a life-threatening matter, a mitah, and it has to be for an important person. So Kohen Gadol is only judged by 71 for capital cases, but for makot and for other things, it would be a regular court of 3, like every other person. Now we said
not 23.
Not 23 for makot, no. 3. Now continue the Gemara, Me'id u'me'idin oto. He can testify, and you can testify about him. Says Gemara, why in the world does he have to testify? Me'id, what do you mean he has to testify? Now, remember, it's a very interesting detail you should think about, which is, there's essentially a commandment or a requirement for a person who knows testimony to testify. What's the commandment? What's the requirement? So really it comes from Hashavat Avedah, right? You saw somebody borrow $1,000. The person can't recover $1,000 because nobody saw it. You have a responsibility, if you know about it, to go and tell them, right? The question about non-monetary things, saying that you saw somebody mechalel Shabbat and he'll get killed, is that Hashavat Avedah, his soul? Anyways, you could talk about that, but let's just talk about money for simplicity. So a Kohen Gadol has to testify, and you could testify about him, right? Says the Gemara, but although it's a responsibility to testify, we know, if we recall from the beginning of Bava Metzia, that there are times where you don't have to actually fulfill your responsibility to return an Avedah, right? For example, if it's not a fik fodo, if it's not your respect. So if respect is an important matter here, maybe a Kohen Gadol should be exempted from testimony because it's not respectful to make him go to court and say that he saw Joe borrow money from, Ruvain. So let's read that inside. So this is where Me'id, you say a Kohen Gadol has to testify, but Tanya, remember, we learned this whole Gemara in Bava Metzia, Vehatalamta, right? The Torah says that you shouldn't see someone's lost object and ignore it. The talamta means ignore it. But it says it in a funny way. And we darshan, in fact, sometimes you can ignore it. right? So pamim shata mitalem, pamim shiata mitalem. Sometimes you see someone suffering or struggling or their object lost. Sometimes you should recover it for them. Sometimes you don't have to recover it for them. What's an example? A ketzad. Let's say you're a kohen who beit hakfarot. You see your friend's beautiful Rolex, but it's in a cemetery, and you are a kohen. So, if you walk by, they may never get it again because Rolexes don't sit around for a long time, but you don't have to walk into the cemetery and get it because you're not allowed to become tamei. Or, let's say you are an elder, you're a senior, respected person, and it's not lefik kvodo to go and pick this thing up from the garbage that you saw it in or whatever it might be. Or, then we have the case in Bava Metzia. Let's say, Rashi always brings the case. Let's say you polish diamonds for a living, right? So your hourly wage is very high, right? Say it's $5,000 an hour. You're going to spend 15 minutes to go help the guy find his watch. It might be worth more than the watch. Remember, he has to pay you for your lost wages. So it's not worth it for him to come to say, here's your watch. You owe me $20,000, right? So I think, so those cases, you're not supposed to get the Avedah. The Kachnemer Vitalamta. So says Gemara, if that's the case, why does the Kohen Gadol have to say testimony? Why don't you say it's not lefik kvodo, right? And so it's true. That's not his honor to go to court. Amar Rav Yosef, you're right. It's probably not usually his honor. But if the king is in court and the Kohen Gadol knows testimony about the king, Me'id Lamelech, he can be a testimony for the king, right? So that's where it is. The king obviously is more honorable, let's say, higher darga, higher level than the Kohen Gadol. So the Kohen Gadol can testify for a king. Says Gemara, you just told me the king, no one testifies about a king ever. That's Gemara, right? Where am I? That's not lo dam lo dininoto. What do you mean? Lo me'ir lo me'idinoto. No one says testimony about a king, even a Kohen Gadol. Ella says Gemara, Amar B'Zera, it means me'id le ben melech. If the king's son, right, you watch the king's son borrow money or lend money or something, you can testify for the king's son because the king's son, at least that's mechubad. He's the royal family. Says, what royal family? Ben Melech had Yodhu. We don't believe in this whole business of princes and things. The king's son is a head yod. We don't have special rules. Now, of course, all Tanakh speaks against that, but nonetheless, right? We don't have special rules for a king's son. Ella, what we mean is me'id bifnei melech. It means that if the king is in the Sanhedrin, the king is there, Kohen Gadol can come and testify because it's respectful in front of the king. Says Gemara, it's interesting, but we don't generally allow the king to be in court. We don't generally let the king come to Sanhedrin. We're going to discuss this more tomorrow, but our Mishnah said lo dam lo daninoto, which seems to be the same idea. Tosfos is bothered why we bring a different source. But either way, we generally don't bring the king because no one's going to argue with the king, right? So you can't have a court and the king says an opinion and all of a sudden everyone's like, I agree, like it's not much of a court. So generally we don't allow the king to be part of a court. Says Gemara, you're right, but this is a special case, right? Because we need the Kohen Gadol's testimony. And the Kohen Gadol shouldn't come to court because it's below his cover. So in order to get the Kohen Gadol to come to court, we ask the king to show up. So the king shows up to the galley, right? The Kohen Gadol can now come because the king is there. After the Kohen Gadol says what he says, the king leaves, right? So now they can discuss it without the king being present. But the Kohen Gadol only testifies in front of the king. So let's read that inside. Because of the kavod, the yoker, the value of the Kohen Gadol, Ata, the king would come, the yativ, and sit in the court. You accept the testimony from the Kohen Gadol because he can now come and give it because the king is present. So then the king gets up and leaves. And we can analyze the din without the king being present. Because although we're terrified of doing any judgment in front of the king, because we're afraid that he's going to sway it one way or the other, he can be there for the process and not there for the deliberations. So that's what you would have to do in order to get a Kohen Gadol to testify in court. Now, Gufa, says Gemara, let's go back to that. It says in the Braita, Ein Moshivin Melech b'Sanhedrin, which we're going to discuss more tomorrow. You don't allow the king to sit in Sanhedrin. V'lo Melech v'Kohen Gadol b'Ibor Shana. You're not allowed to have a king or a Kohen Gadol be present. We talked about this last week in the recording. I don't know if anyone heard it, but we talked about, I said last week in the recording, we talked about planning for Ibor Shana, right? They have to get together and discuss, is this a good year? Do we need to make a leap year? You don't allow the king or the Kohen Gadol to be part of those deliberations, because we think that they're gonna sway it in the improper way. We'll see why in a second. So first of all, Melech b'Sanhedrin dichtiv, it says in the pasuk lo taneh al riv, that you shouldn't argue, you shouldn't be involved in a fight, which means lo taneh al rav. You can't criticize, you can't argue with your rav, with someone greater than you. So you can't have a king in court because you won't, and no one will say anything after the king says something. And lo melech v'kohen gadol b'ibur shana. Now, why don't you have the king and the kohen gadol b'ibur shana? So the melech mishum afsanya. The king is mishum. I don't know what the word afsanya means in English. I don't know what language it is, but Rashi makes it sound like it's the budget. Do you have someone have? Yeah, that's what he says.
Wages.
Wages. Yeah. Okay. So Rashi explains that, the king basically obviously is in charge of the economy. That's the role of the king, right? And the annual budget is $4 billion, but it's very convenient if you add a month to the year and you don't have to change the annual budget, right? So the king would very much like to add a month to this year because he doesn't have to come up with the new salaries for another month, right?
But this says here, I mean, Art Scroll says that it's specifically the wages for the army.
Right. That's what Rashi explains. But in general, I mean, that's the king's role, right? That's who the king would pay wages to, is the soldiers, right? But you only pay annual wage according to this Gemara. And so if the year is a little bit longer, it's in the king's favor. Now, of course, you can't make every year a little bit longer, right? You get in big trouble. But the king he's got to come up with a certain amount of money. If you give him one more month, everyone appreciates another month before they have to pay their bills, right? So the king would be very interested in having a leap year. And the Kohen Gadol, mishum tzina. The Kohen Gadol, because it's very cold. Now, why is that a problem? If you recall, the Kohen Gadol's big day of the year, of course, is Yom Kippur. And Rashi says on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol dunks in the swimming pool a lot of times, right? So he would much rather have Yom Kippur fall out in September than fall out in October, right, so to speak. And so we're worried that the Kohen Gadol is going to, be very impacted by the weather. And now Tosas is bothered because Tosas says, what do you mean? We used to heat up the mikvah all the time. So it's not, what's he worried? It's a heated swimming pool. So, of course, even though it might be a heated swimming pool, you get out of the mikvah and it's a little chilly in the air. But Tosas says because you have to walk on the floor barefoot, right? So the stones are cold. So either way, it's very cold. And so the Kohen Gadol is not going to want it to be a leap year because he wants Yom Kippur to come earlier. So therefore, we don't invite him to the deliberations because we don't really trust that he's going to have the national interest at heart. He's going to have his own personal interests. Now, says the Gemara, you see from here something very interesting. We're going to discuss this.
This is all so relevant today with Bibi under trial.
Wow, that's an interesting place to go. But okay.
But he keeps asking for a delay and to push off the trial, and he's not able to testify because of the war and the budget. And
I think we got it, James. Okay. So we don't invite the king, or I don't know whether Bibi's the king or the Kohen Gadol, but we don't invite him into the deliberations. Amar of Papa, now says of Papa, you know what you see from here? Shma mina shata batu yarcha aza. We're going to have a very lot of debate. We've actually had a bunch of it last week as well about what considerations we bring in when we decide about whether to make a leap year. And what you see from here, says Rav Papa, is that temperature is not really one of those conditions, right? You see that in general, the year, it's very hard to translate, but the year goes after the months, which means that the temperature is independent of whether we make it a leap year or not, meaning we don't take that into play. We don't take into account in a deep way, oh, it's going to be very cold in Tishrei, so we should make it a leap year. And that in general, they wouldn't do it as a communal thing. The Kohen Gadol might do it as a personal thing, right? And that's what we're worried about. So you see that from here, right? Because otherwise, if everyone's worried about the temperature, what does the Kohen Gadol need to say? Why don't we all say, look, it's not really a good idea to have Sukkot when it's very cold. So if it turns out that in our calendar, Yom Kippur is coming out in October, let's make it a leap year, or the other way. Yom Kippur is coming out in, I don't know, whatever it is, Yom Kippur is going to be too late. Let's not make it a leap year so it doesn't get to be too cold, right? If Yom Kippur is the end of September, we don't want to make a leap year, it'll be the end of October, right? So you see from here that we don't actually take that into consideration. Aini, but is that true? V'hanach shlosha ro'ei bakar. There's a famous story of the 3 ro'ei bakar. How do you say ro'ei bakar in English? Because they're shepherds. Herdsmen. Okay, that's a great word. I love it. So I would call them shepherds, but we generally think of shepherds as being ro'ei tzon, right? So these are people, herdsmen, as Miriam put it. So they're in charge of cows, right? Or cattle. Dahavi kaimu, they were sitting around. V'shamina Rabbanan deka'amri. Now the Rabbanan heard these people talking about the weather, right? They obviously have a very good sense of the weather because they spend their life out there feeling everything with their animals, etc. So Chad Amar, now one said, there's the million-dollar question that everybody asks from the groundhog is spring coming, right? Spring is considered to be the month of Adar, the beginning of spring. Adar starts spring. No, it's very cold in Adar, but it gets warm a little bit too. And of course, the month before Adar, which is Shvat, right, is very cold. It's the middle of the winter, or the end of the winter. So the one of the shepherds, the herdsman, said, "Im bachir v'lakish kechada yinatz." If the early grain and the middle grain come up, bachir meaning yinatz means they sprout at the same time. So they would plant chitin first because chitin stays in the ground longer. Then they wheat. Then they would plant barley. If they both sprout at the same time, that's a sign that it's Adar. Dein hu Adar. V'im lav, let dein Adar. If not, then Adar's not here yet. Meaning things could sprout, right? We all know you could get warm weather and your what are those flowers that come? Daffodils come up really early, right? Sometimes. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the spring until it's both coming together. So that's what one of them said. Chad Amar, now one said, you know how I know if it's Adar? Im Tor, you got your cow. Okay, bitsafar b'telig yamut. In the morning, it's practically dying of frost, right? So it's freezing cold. But b'tiara, by the afternoon, b'tol te'ena yidmoch, all right? It has to go to the shade of not the banana tree, but the shade of the
fig tree.
Fig tree, thank you. Because it gets so hot, right? Meaning it's freezing cold, and we all know this happens at the end of the winter, right? It's freezing cold in the morning, there's still frost. By the afternoon, it's boiling hot, or hot enough, that the cow needs to go into the shade of the tree, and yishlach mashchei, and has to rub itself against it because it's getting really overheated, so that's just sweating away. Deinu Adar, then you know it's Adar, because it's both cold in the morning and very hot in the afternoon. V'imlav let dein Adar. But if not, then it's not Adar. And for the third one said, Chad Amar, im kidum takif lechada yehei yifach bluich nafek lekublei. Kidum takif means you have a eastern wind that's very strong, right? Meaning you have a strong wind from the east that blows in your face. The chada yehei yifach, it blows in front of you, bluich, and nafik lekublei. Your breath can come against it, meaning you're able to blow against it strong enough to overcome the wind. Then Dein hu Adar, then you know it's Adar. So you have a cold wind coming, but it's not so cold that you can't sort of overblow it. Then unlike today, right? Today you were outside the cold wind, you couldn't blow anything against it. But if you can blow against the wind, then Dein hu Adar, then you know it's Adar. V'imlav let Dein Adar. So anyways, all these people basically said, these are signs of Adar, these are the temperature, and the Rabbanan, Ibru Rabbanan, Nahi Shata, and the Rabbanan made it a leap year. So you see clearly that the Rabbanan basically included the weather as a primary factor in deciding whether to be a leap year or not a leap year. Remember, we had earlier all the other factors, right? You do it based on whether the people are traveling. You do it based on whether the molad, the seat, what do you call it? Called the equinox. Anyways, whether the molad, it's not the molad I'm looking for, but anyways, whether the seasons
days are getting longer and shorter.
So, but the question is whether or not
the tides,
solstice.
Yeah, anyway, I'm just forgetting the word. It'll come. So you do it based on many other factors, but do you take temperature into the factor? So you see here from the fact that Chachamim listen to these shepherds that you do, which goes against the Kohen Gadol, because why would we care about the Kohen Gadol? He's telling you I'm going to be freezing, so listen to the Kohen Gadol. You don't want everyone to be freezing, right? Says the Gemara, really, V'tizber, you really think the Rabbanan, Aravata Samach, you really think the Rabbanan relied on shepherds? That's not, these are old wives' tales. El Rabbanan Achush B'nayo Samach. They had their own calculation about when the Tkufa, that's what I'm looking for, when the Tkufa would fall out, when the timing would fall out. The Ro'ei Bakar is to you who disdayam notayim. They relied, remember we talked about earlier, you can have all kinds of supports, all kinds of other things that strengthen or weaken your argument, and they basically used the Ro'ei Bakar as a support, but they essentially did not rely on them fundamentally. And so we don't fundamentally change the calendar just for the weather. We use it as a support, but it's not a primary issue. And therefore, we don't want the Kohen Gadol to come in, because the Kohen Gadol, the weather is very, very important for him, because he can't wear shoes and he's got to jump in the water. And so therefore we don't invite him to the deliberations. We're going to stop there and continue tomorrow, God willing, from the 3 dots.
Is anyone invited to deliberations?
No, they would have, you have to be invited. Remember, we learned last week, if you don't get invited, you get called out. And unless there's someone to save your skin, you're gonna get very embarrassed. But a Kohen Gadol could be a Talmid Chacham, right? He would be very important to have in the deliberations, but they're not allowed to invite him because we're afraid he's gonna change it for.
It's not a public process.
It's not a public process, no. It's very private.
What is this phrase of blowing against the wind? It means like you're actually blowing literally, or like you can withstand the wind?
It means, right, that, I mean, it means that you overcome the power of the winds. You don't feel as cold when you blow against them. And it's just a way to say that the wind, although it seems strong, and cold, is not really, there's more bark than bite. Let's put it that way.
Great.
Okay, Shavua Tov, what time are we learning tomorrow?
Shavua Tov, you were definitely missed.
Thank you. I'm back. What's the $1 million time tomorrow?
Morning.
Okay, 7:45 a.m. We'll all be here, God willing.
Okay, great.
God willing.
Okay, I'll put on the WhatsApp just so we can confirm.
Thank you.
See you all tomorrow.
Thank you and good night.
Shabbat tov.
Good night.
Shavua tov.